Good evening, everyone. Thank you for making our time to join us in this conversation. Just a brief introduction on the people who are here and why we are here. My name is Lynda Iroulo. I'm an assistant professor of international relations here at Georgetown University, and we are. This talk is organized in the context of a book project that is being organized through CIRS. So it's a book on the introduction of African regional organizations. So this book came to be because African regional organizations, and by that we mean the African Union and the 8 regional economic communities, have been in existence for a long time. Like these, organizations can be traced all the way back, from the 40s to the 50s and down. However, there are kind of like snippets of articles and papers out there on these topics, but not a single compilation of a handbook on African regional organizations. So this is what this project is doing, to kind of like go back to revisit the ideological and intellectual origins of these regional organizations and put them together as a handbook that would be relevant for senior and undergrad students and graduate students. So on that note, you can see in the audience, we have some of our project members here and a few of the representatives up here with us, and I will start with the introductions, and then we go into the conversation. We have on my right, I have Oheneba Boateng. He's a visiting assistant professor of international relations at Bucknell University. To my far right end, I have Dalva Raposo. She is a Georgetown University, Qatar undergraduate student majoring in international politics. To my left, I have Sempiija. He's an associate professor at the Mohammed Polytechnic University in Morocco. And then last but not the least, definitely not the least, Densua Mumford. She is an assistant professor of international relations at Leiden University. So these are our speakers today, and we will be talking about sort of like African regionalism, the achievements, the challenges, and the prospects of regionalism on the continent. The format of the conversation will be very informal. We are hoping that we'll get more questions and conversations and interact with the audience. We will give 2 minutes each for the presenters to give their inputs. I know that's very little time, but we will give you some, time for your inputs, after which we will open the floor for, conversation, questions, and some discussion. So I will do ladies first and go with Densua. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to make a brief statement. My statement is about taking seriously decolonization as an analytical concept and praxis in regionalism research. It is inspired by 2 works, mostly the book Decolonization and Afrofeminism by Sylvia Tamale, where she argues that Pan-Africanism needs feminism in order to realize the former's decolonizing potential. But also a little inspired by the book called Elite Capture by Olufemi Taiwo. He argues that elite capture happens when only the privileged of a minority group are given opportunities to reshape social structures. This would include people like ourselves here on the panel. And minority elites inevitably reproduce the social structures that allowed them to become elites alongside dominant groups in the first place, rather than changing them for the better. Based on these books, I argue that we need to bring decolonization back to the core of practicing and researching African regionalism. African regionalism was originally about decolonization, liberating African peoples from colonial domination by fostering an alternative solidarity based on shared African experiences, knowledges, and capacity. This is very different to the focus on development and related agendas that is prevalent today. Decolonization was a project to build alternatives, alternative ways of knowing each other and the world, and alternative ways of practicing being with each other and in the world. As Frantz Fanon stated in The Wretched of the Earth, decolonization is the creation of new men, and I explicitly highlight in line with Tamale the gendered nature of that statement. But more about that later. It is about creating new concepts so that we do not build our future as Africans on the same oppressive structures that were used against us. Structures like capitalism, binary opposition, racialized beliefs, gendered beliefs, neoliberalism, also known as the worship of the market, separation of mind from body, separation of emotion from knowledge, the practice of hierarchy, and so on. We were meant to escape all of those structures, not just gain legal sovereignty. When I say bring back decolonization, I do not mean rewinding us to a 1960s understanding of the term. Decolonization was itself informed by sexism and the invisibilization of non-elites in the struggles. Diversity amongst Africans was barely acknowledged and wrestled with, by which I do not just mean ethnic diversity, but gender, sexuality, ability, age, class, and other forms of diversity. Tamale talks about this in her chapter Towards Feminist Pan-Africanism and Pan-African Feminism. It is therefore important, in my view, to bring to African regionalism a stronger concept of decolonization that converses with the full spectrum of cultures and peoples that make up the Pan-African community. That is, it must be inherently an intersectional concept that is informed by the plurality of African struggles. Echoing Tamale, the question I am asking this audience to discuss, and all of us who work on African regionalism, is to what extent has African regionalism actually empowered Africans in their full diversity to foster alternative ways of knowing and being based on their particular cultures? This brings me to Taiwo's theorizing about the elite capture of social justice movements. When Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Haile Selassie, and all the other leaders made the call for independence at the conference that established the Organization of African Unity, OAU, we all thought we knew what they meant. But Frantz Fanon warned us that African leaders have a particular understanding of decolonization. He called elites the national bourgeoisie, useless imitators of modernity who wanted the luxuries enjoyed by the white bourgeoisie without having the skills to build and maintain the necessary means of production. This national bourgeoisie are parasitical, according to Fanon, producing nothing, just extracting and making Africa the brothel of Europe. Again, gendered language. Thus, first-generation leaders and their successors have interpreted decolonization in a very particular way. They have shored up their own independence, but not the independence of the polities they rule. They have made themselves independent of the national healthcare systems they regularly fail to fund. They go to Europe to get their healthcare. Their children are being trained to be independent at Harvard and Oxford and Sciences Po. They have made themselves immune to supposed checks, such as electoral commissions and courts. They have inured themselves to societal critique and necessary guidance from their citizens. And they have effectively deafened themselves to the cries for justice coming from the plurality of their own peoples. For example, I note the struggles of lesbian communities campaigning at the AU, as shown in the documentary by Beverly Ditsey titled The Commission, From Silence to Resistance. It's free to watch on YouTube. It's called The Commission, From Silence to Resistance. The documentary shows that while LGBTQI+ communities in various parts of the continent are targeted and murdered by fellow Africans, the elites in the AU will dither about enshrining the right to life and the right for all Africans to be treated with equal dignity in the Pan-African community. A decolonized Africa is a continent where we do not contemplate murder based on our inevitable differences, and where our regional institutions guarantee equal African status rather than deciding who is African and who isn't. African regionalism has become subject to elite capture, is what I am saying, and as far as it ensures independence for the few and not justice for all. Final paragraph, I promise. To turn this dynamic around, we should take seriously the decolonial quality, the decolonial properties of African regionalism and investigate African regional organizations in terms of whether or not their practices foster alternative ways of knowing and being that get us away from colonial oppression. My proposition can be addressed and critiqued on multiple levels. First, you can ask, should decolonization be revived seriously as the main driver, or should we stick with the narrower and less ambitious language of development? Even if we agree to revive decolonization, how do we define and identify its practice in African regionalism? And finally, where should we look for inspiring alternative visions of the Pan-African future? That is, which radical African visions exist that we can follow? My hope lies in the fact that African regionalism is a social construct that we, all of us, reproduce. It is ever-changing, never static. And if African regionalism is capable of some of the radical reforms that we have seen in the past, then it is capable of more in the future. Our voices as scholars, when joined with the voices of the plurality of peoples in the Pan-African community, and our creative radical ideas will be important for reshaping African regionalism into a practice for justice. That is my hope. Thank you.
I don't know how to follow that. And I must say that you're going to get much less than that from me. So just get ready for that. So for me, I've been studying African regionalism for a long time, and some of the things that I've taken away from many years of studying regionalism is that the first one is that even though the whole idea from at the continental level, at the sub-regional level, are organized on the ideology of Pan-Africanism. But I think one of the difficulties in the process has been failure as Africans to build or to translate Pan-Africanism as an idea into practice. So I think the main challenge is that every problem that we faced since the 1960s has been about this struggle, about how to make Pan-Africanism real, how to let that reflect in the lives of our people, how to use that to drive our development. Okay, and one way to look at this is to look at the divide between what the elites talk about when they meet in their various capitals and what the people on the ground are trying to do. And I mean, I think most of us who study African regionalism do agree that there is some sort of elite capture, as Densua just said. But on the other side, I think there is a lot of people-to-people, civil society level integration that is often not talked about. One of the easy examples would be, I think we mentioned sports during our previous presentations, but within African music, for instance, there's a lot of collaboration across various countries. And when I look at the trend of people-to-people interaction across countries, it takes me back to what Frans Fanon said, that he does not believe that integration will come from the leaders at the top. He believes that integration of the continent will come from below. It gets to a point where it is the people who are going to demand this integration from the leaders, right? So in some cases, you can say that the people are actually ahead of the leaders when it comes to the extent to which they want to interact with one another across borders. But the problem is that some of these things are also limited by official policy, okay? Because apart from maybe West Africa and East Africa, the process of visa-free travel, for instance, is not that widespread in the other regions. And when you look at recent surveys, West Africa and East Africa are also supposedly the most integrated part of the continent, and this is because the people in this part of the continent do interact more. So I think the people have been ahead of the leaders in trying to translate Pan-Africanism as an idea into practice. Okay, so I think for us, when I talk of the challenges, especially, I think it is about how the elites at the headquarters or wherever they meet are able to connect whatever they are doing or thinking about to what is already happening on the ground. I think it is through that connection that you have true integration. But for as long as there's this divide where like the two processes, elite policy and everyday interactions, are going in parallel ways, it's going to be difficult for us to achieve any sort of integration. Thank you.
Thank you. Just as a side note, for those who were not part of our earlier conversation, like the book project is about regional organizations, so it's mostly a top-down analysis that we do. But now our conversation is going in the direction of regionalism from the below. So probably we need a second book after this. Over to you, Dalva.
In any talk revolving around Africa, political, present, future, socioeconomic, we always have to consider the youth. 60% of the African population is made of people under the age of 25, making the youth the continent's greatest asset for growth and development agenda. But talking about African, the youth, the things that are important for them are three: education, employability, and political participation. With shared markets, communality and education are needed in regional level, allowing a coordination of educational programs that have agreements on minimum academic standards and ensure equivalence and comparability of qualifications between and within countries, so harmonization. Benchmarks must be established for qualifications, program delivery, and certifications. So they have to have the same credit systems, quality assurance mechanisms, accreditation, recognition of qualifications, quality control, and even language uniformability within the African education. We don't have that yet in terms of integration within regional communities or regional organizations. The African higher education cooperation initiatives are also always initiated by external sources, such as organizations that derive from Europe, from Asia, from Latin America. We need to see more investment of African regional organizations in this realm. Another problem with African education is that higher education in Africa inherited their academic structure from their European colonizers. So they created a system that is segregated along colonial lines. So we have Anglophone systems, Francophones, Lusophones. We have this educational system that facilitates a north to south cooperation, but doesn't facilitate south to south, which poses a very big problem within cooperation between countries in the same region. And then we have the problem of employability. Two of the principal reasons for Africa's high unemployment rates, which affects the youth, of course, because they're the majority, is a mismatch between educational systems and the skills needed for the labor market, and the saturated public services and small private sector bases that are unable to employ large numbers of people. Even though we're investing in education, we are having a lot of people that are leaving universities, but they don't find any job opportunities that can put these skills to work and make them an asset for development in the country. And then we talk about political participation of young Africans. We have a lot of efforts going on within the regional organizations, such as the EAC Youth Ambassadors Platform, the Mano River Youth Platform. But the problem with these councils and parliaments that it's often limited to one-time events. And this creates a big problem in terms of policy implementation, because there is no continuity. In order for the youth's energy and ideas to be translated into policy and sustainable action, continuous active involvement of them as stakeholders is required. Governments still lack an understanding of the benefits of youth involvement in consultation processes. Advocacy-based groups have limited capacity to maintain momentum for continued action. And national youth policies need to be implemented with legislation that acknowledges and guarantees the involvement of young people in decision-making process. Thank you so much.
Norman, over to you.
Thanks very much. These are all difficult acts to follow. I mean, very interesting angles and discussions on regionalism. I just want to take you a bit on a journey. If you look at post-independent African states, they were very obsessed with the issue of sovereignty. I mean, the OAU stated that sovereignty is sacrosanct. But recently, we've seen a change in that by sub-regional bodies whereby states are willing to trade their sovereignty, though we're laughing about it with Professor Mumford. What kind of sovereignty is it that they're trading? I mean, some scholars have argued that African states have negative sovereignty in that it's in legal format and it's basically really not working for them. But anyway, what I wanted to stress is the fact that they stopped looking at sovereignty as something that is sacrosanct, that they need to protect. And so slowly by slowly, they are beginning to give it up because we live in an interconnected world where we have common challenges, but also, I mean, with this security challenges. For example, migration in Africa is 80% within the continent. And so we need to talk about those issues as sub-regional bodies or even as a continental body. And so the appetite for regionalization has been very, very great in the, since I think the 70s and towards the end of the Cold War. Though the problem that we have is that we're having overlapping sub-regional bodies, and so issues of loyalty come into play. For example, Tanzania belongs to SADC and East African Community, and there's a point when Uganda and Kenya felt Tanzania wasn't loyal to the project of the East African Community because deeper integration with the East African Community would mean Tanzania giving up its membership to SADC. And so that was an issue. Today, DR Congo has just joined East African Community. Congo is part of SADC, you know. And so these are the issues that are beginning to emerge. Overlapping memberships and also loyalties being split. And so it is affecting deeper integration within the countries or the regions that we have today. And so the dense network of sub-regional bodies also, we end up with competing interests, who is going to act where. Recent conflict in Congo, you have, oh yeah, Congo is a new member of the East African Community, so Kenya sends in the troops, but we already have SADC troops in there. Force Intervention Brigade has been there since 2014. Now, who's going to take responsibility for the resolution of the conflict? Multiple players, overlapping memberships, and so we create an a la carte menu of interventions and interferences, and we end up not being able to solve anything. So some of the challenges that I wanted to throw up to you there. Yes, and also I buy into the argument concerning elitist approaches, but also we have an issue whereby decisions are made at the top, and the bottom are not really consulted. And so, again, when do we begin to have a discussion about integration, especially on the community level, or as between communities, as Europeans? For example, Europeans have begun talking about inter-community dialogue, you know, between communities. What are we talking about in Africa about inter-community integration? Kenyans and Ugandans, or Nigerians and Ghanaians integrating on a community level. We're not talking about that. We're talking about economic integration, and then we're talking about summit-level meetings and stuff like that. So I think these are some of the challenges that I wanted to throw out to you there, but I think I'll just leave it there for now, and then maybe we can continue the conversation. Thanks.
So I will open the floor for questions, but before we go into the questions, you know, something I want our panelists to think about. You know, these ideas of regional organizations on the continent started, you know, during the decolonial period. We had a lot of intellectuals, you know, we had the likes of Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, we had the Steve Bikos of South Africa, the Thomas Sankaras of Burkina Faso. These were intellectuals who had a vision for the continent. And you would think that, decades down the line, and now we have these regional organizations. Actually, we have a lot more regional organization in Africa compared to anywhere else. And you would think, some of our problems should be resolved already because we have a lot of regional organizations working on those things. But you still see, the continent facing a lot of challenges. We still hear conversations about still the same narratives of the white man's burden. And these are things that we need to reflect. So why is it that decades down the line, we are still grappling with the same thing? Densua already started taking us through the decolonial aspect of it. What is our role as Africans, and is there an external role? Because I hear that a lot in the policy fields. The external involvement of outsiders in hindering that progress. But I also open it up to the audience because we want this to be an interaction between us and everyone. So, any questions so far? Okay, so what should I, okay, let's start that way.
First of all, thank you so much for everyone for this discussion and the panel itself. My question refers specifically to Mr. Boateng. You actually made a very strong point about bringing Pan-Africanism into practice. It's easy to talk about the terminology itself, but what are we doing to make sure that it is actually we're bringing it into practice, right? And in your work, besides delving into the relationship between the elites and of those of a poor class, have you ever considered of other challenges when it comes to, implying this term into practice? If so, what are the realistic other approaches do you believe that we need to, impose when encountering with the challenges?
Thanks for the questions. I think when it comes to to African regionalism, there are several challenges that we can talk about, and I think it's pretty standard across the organizations. We can talk about funding issues. We can talk about the commitment of the leaders. We can talk about the geographical expanse of the continent. We can talk about, Lynda and I just recently wrote a paper about the divide between the politicians and the bureaucrats who work within the organizations, right? So there are several challenges that we can talk about which prevents the translation from ideology into practice. But I think all of that centers on the political will, of the leaders. Okay. Sometimes I feel like it's either we do not have the true sense of the magnitude of work we need to do, or maybe we have a sense of how much we need to do, but we don't care, right? But whatever it is, I think it comes from the political will, the will to transform things, right? Because there are so many, when it comes to policies, I think if we have maybe a policy competition among regional organizations, the AU probably win, okay, because they have so many policies, right? So they will win. But when it comes to the idea of, providing the finances, being consistent with the programs that we've had, and actually ensuring that member states do, domesticate these policies that they themselves have, adopted at the continental level. These are virtually non-existent, okay? So that's why I was saying that there's a gap between what happens among the politicians and how they get to the ground. And I think what fills the gap is the type of commitment that we get from the leaders. And at this moment, there's very little. There's very little of that. So as to how we can go around that issue, maybe I'm pessimistic on this, but I don't think there's really going to be any change from the top. It's going to be from the people, okay? It's going to be from people who, are doing things outside of what the regional organizations are supposed to do. So I think at some point, the regional organizations may have to play catch up with the people. I mentioned music. There's a lot that is happening in terms of sports. I don't even know how connected the AU is with CAF, for instance. I'm not sure if there's any relationship. Okay, there's a lot of, I always make fun of Lynda. There are a lot of Nigerians who own properties in Ghana. There's a huge integration in the real estate market, at least in West Africa, that I know. But I don't know if the African Union has an interest in this. Okay, so a lot of things are happening outside of the former AU structures. And I think at some point, it's going to be the people who are going to drive their own integration, and the leaders will have to catch up. So the solution to me will come from the people and not from the leaders, because I think they've had enough time to prove that they either don't care or they're incompetent. Okay, so I would put my faith in the people.
Okay, do we have more questions? I think I see. Yes, yeah.
Yes, so I think, Oheneba, you've partly addressed what I was thinking about, but when you think about regional integration in Africa, or the more you read about it, the more you see disintegration, actually. You see a lot of sub-regional organizations trying to be a bit more independent from the AU, and that comes with a lot of trust issues, loyalty issues. But then if we look a little bit beyond, then you get to the individual countries and you begin to lose hope in this idea of integration. You see the treatment of minority groups, the treatment of the masses who don't belong to the political elite. Then you see the resilience of colonial structures that exclude people who could meaningfully participate in shaping policy. So when I look at how individual countries are not able to be inclusive in their governance spaces, we see a lot of colonial structures in the treatment of women, young people, people who don't have that privilege to have access to power. Then you really see that national level elite capture being replayed at the regional levels. And that is where regional integration is more about bureaucrats or elite consensus and contestations. But then we need to start looking at how we can break these colonial structures, not only up there, but from the national level. Even in Africa, we have this idea of hybrid governance. At the traditional level, you find that young people, women don't have a say in traditional governance. So if we begin to break these smaller spaces, I think then we'll begin to expand the space of participation and how people feel part of it, so that we can then have a conversation of, the African citizen, then participating in African markets and political spaces. These are some of the spaces where I think regional integration could be improved from below. Thank you.
Just trying to promote the book more, talking about regionalism from below and advancing on the points that Dalva made. Again, Sebastian, you're right that we have a lot of challenges at the grassroots, and one of them being the fact that even as African youths, there is a certain colonial education that we get. I always tell people, and they find it surprising, that a lot of African scholars, I got to read them when I started researching, when I became a PhD student. I was never taught, I never read Nkrumahs or the Sankaras at the university. We were never taught these things. And I think, that is a good place to start. Hopefully the book does this by actually teaching African regionalism, which is something that we didn't get at our time, and just start from regionalism from below. We have, so Donette and Huyam.
Yes, good evening, and of course to the panelists, thank you for the very informative sentiments you hold. And my question is this: do we really need formalized institutions to then integrate? And my idea when we talk about decolonization is we have overdone it and we need to stop, because African regionalism and African regional integration does not require a treaty. We never required an okay to marry across the border. Trade and informal African trade has always thrived without the European influence. We've always had informal banking systems. Our exchange systems have always been there. We do not require foreign documents. What is the essence of an African going to school and amassing several academic documents only to go back to the village with no job? So have we overdone it, and do we need to stop?
Have we overdone it? Do we need to stop?
I think that's a, is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think I disagree with the particular language you're using of have we overdone it and do we need to stop? I would rephrase it myself, right? To say more, have we conceptualized it wrong, and therefore have we practiced it incorrectly in a way that's unhelpful? And this is what I mean by we need to bring back to the core decolonizing questions about what African regionalism, whether it is this formal treaty-based version, which is just a narrow part of Pan-Africanism, African regionalism, right? And the idea was emancipation. The idea was justice for all peoples in the African community. And instead, what's happened, and this was something that I had to scrap, but one of my fears is that African regionalism has actually devolved into a superficial practice of governance, right? So instead of the language of decolonization, of justice for African peoples, what we talk about is, development, which is essentially a language of just making states better at controlling their citizens, and then managing the region in a way that just elevates elites, right? But if we can reconceptualize African regionalism to be something else that actually is inherently connected to the people's struggles, then we would practice it differently. And maybe there's space for treaties, but I don't know, right? That's something for that alternative parallel universe to decide. But yeah, I really like this idea of going back to this question of what have we actually created, and was this what we imagined?
Yeah, thanks very much for that intervention. And maybe I wanted to also talk about is that the idea of the concept of the state from an African perspective is not, we don't perceive the state the way the Westphalian model is perceived. I mean, issues of borders, for example, borders are very fluid for many Africans. And so I think we need also to go back to the idea of the state, because when you look at the formalization of institutions, we are falling into the usual issues around, Westphalian state model, formalized institutions and stuff like that. So do we need to revisit the concept of the state from an African perspective, and how do we perceive that as Africans? And how can that also feed into the regionalization discourse? No, so maybe I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, the little I want to add is that I think one thing I've observed about the African, studying it since it started life as the OAU up to now, is that sometimes I think the more the organization evolves, the less effective it becomes, when you compare that with the OAU times. And one example I'll give is that in the decolonization era, I'll come to that. From the time Botswana got independence up to, I think, 1980, about 15% of the people who worked in Botswana's civil service were not from Botswana. They were from other African countries. And then not to talk of those who were working for the, non-Ghanaians who were working for the Ghanaian government, who were schooling there for free, who were schooling in different, other African countries. Okay, but the more we move towards this idea of concept of integration, the less you see this interactions happening through the formal system. Okay, and I think that is because we've taken this idea of integration to be too formal and rule-based, which when rules come in, they do limit the kind of interactions that we have already. So sometimes, I mean, people have their issues with the OAU, but sometimes I think in some cases they were, or in some issue areas, they were more effective than the African Union is now. Now, as to the question as to whether we've done too much of decolonization or not, I think we've not done enough, but we've just been doing the wrong kind of decolonization. Okay, because you talked about how this sort of informal regionalization has been happening for a long time. And then the next thing you talked about is the borders, right? These are colonial structures. And these are the sort of structural factors that we need to remove. Talk of the borders, talk of the language. I mean, how many of us Africans here don't have English names? Okay, like in Ghana, the Ghanaians here will probably know. In Ghana, we have something called Abrofudin, which basically means my white name. Okay, yeah, and this is something that a lot of Ghanaians have. Talk of our educational system. How many of us know about other African countries? Sometimes you really need to make the efforts on your own before you can learn about other African countries. So I think we've been looking at the wrong place, or maybe at the right place, but for too long when we are trying to decolonize. And I think what we really need to deal with are the structural factors. Okay.
And Dalva?
I think informal integration has been happening in Africa for a long time, but there's still so much to be done in terms of formal integration, and it's very necessary, and I don't think we have done not even 1% of it, of all that we need to do, especially in what regards education and employability. When talking about political participation for people, we can even go down to the national level, because you cannot have regional participation without national participation. But in education and employability, it's so important because migration is in 80% in Africa. People are always moving around. But this not only happens in the informal sector, it also happens in the formal sector. We have people who want to move from Mozambique to South Africa, for example, and they have to take a new visa every 6 months as a student. This is unacceptable as a country of SADC. There should have been easier methods to allow people to have more mobility, to allow, and even just giving people space of the opportunity of having this mobility allows people to take more chances. Without these things, we cannot really invest in education and employability. People need to move goods and services. It's very easy to move it informally, but then how can you really establish credibility of your service or of your goods if you don't really have a formal barrier, credibility to it? And then, for example, exporting a car from China to Abuja can cost $5,000, and then exporting a car from Abuja to Dar es Salaam can cost 10 times that. These are things that we need formalities to take away these barriers. We cannot just say, let's not do treaties, let's just take away. We need something to hold our governance accountable to that standard.
Thanks. But what I'm also hearing is that it seems our regional organizations have hindered integration and not promoted it. But Huyam, you had your hand up for a question. Let's go.
Is it working? Okay, perfect. So thank you so much, and good evening, first to everyone. I may sound a bit confusing because this is a topic that I'm really interested in, and each time I'm thinking about what should we do, to get to what we aspire. And the things that we have, many authors, and everyone says different thing. I will maybe start with what has been last said by Dalva. So she said, well, let's say we have those regional organization. Normally for the member states, if having this integration is good for them, it's good, it aligns with their interest. Why this is not happening? Because I mean, we know when the regional economic communities, they have adopted the treaties constituting them, I mean, they knew that if they have, for instance, a free mobility of goods and services, normally that would be good for them. But why we don't have that yet? Because normally, if it's in your interest, you're going to do it. And again, let's go back to Africa. A lot of intrastate conflicts that may turn into interstate conflict if not well managed. Do you think that integration would be possible with all this political conflicts going on? I mean, for me, that's not going to be possible. So that's why I want you to hear your point of view. I mean, how can we reach integration? I mean, how can we reach development if we don't have security, if we don't have political instability? I mean, for me, that's not possible. Okay, if we go into the approach from, I mean, down to up and then go to the people, do we like really have integration between the people? Because some of the conflicts, they are ethnic conflicts, which means they have arose between people from different backgrounds because of their identity. It's not like on the state stage, like it's like at the citizen stage. So, I mean, how would possible to have this integration? I mean, if we have those conflicts between the citizens. One of the authors have been talking about like we need to maybe to forget about our identities and not having this strong belonging to our identities, etc., etc. But then we have other authors who have been saying, well, before colonization, we had this golden age of democracy where we were following like the tribes rule. We had like the pure democracy. We don't need to follow this imported democracy of the West because it's not working. We need to go back to how the tribes were working. So which means, I mean, we need to go back to our tribes, which means we need to have this strong belonging to our identity. But this would lead again to conflict. Then how to do it? And then regarding the youth, I mean, again, if we're going to the approach from down to up, we're not going to be waiting from the leaders to respond to our requests. As you said, I mean, the African continent is the continent with the most youth in the world. We are like a lot of youth. Can we do something? Normally, yes, we can. But let me tell you something based on my personal experience. When it comes to the circle of the youth who really care about their states, who really care about developments, it's a very small circle. And whenever there are events, you can see the same people again and again and again. I'm going to give an example regarding climate change. So some of the states, not only in Africa, like worldwide, they have given the opportunity to youth to participate in the international conferences. So they have, last question. They have trusted this youth, but like during these international conferences, that trust was lost. Why? Because they have not respected the formalities. I mean, they have been showing the people, saying what should not be said during diplomatic meetings. So what's the solution? Because I'm really confused. Thank you.
Thank you. I would take even take that question further to, the problem. She raised the problem of like the conflicts which are ethnic on the continent. The fact that we have, a continent of 54, 55 if you include Western Sahara member states who are totally different in terms of culture and language and colonial experiences. How do we bring these people together to integrate, to identify as African and see like a common goal in terms of opening up borders? Oheneba, you talked about like decolonizing these borders, and I'm thinking, places like South Africa where they don't even want the rest of Africa to come in. Like these are issues we're still grappling with on the continent. It's just kind of like pushing that question further. Who wants to take it?
I think that is because the borders have been allowed to stay for too long. Right. So, and the longer they stay, the harder these ethnic divisions, harden. Okay. The harder people begin to identify themselves by this, because these are physical borders, but the kind of work and impact they have on society are reinforced by the kind of policies that reinforce these borders. Okay. And actually, when you look at conflict across the continent, you realize that a lot of them are caused by people just trying to rejoin their kinfolks on the other side of the border. So a lot of these conflicts are caused by that. Okay, like these colonial borders cut through ethnic, groups, and then you go to bed as an Igbo. The next day you're on the, Yoruba side, but you are still an Igbo, and you have to do something about it, right? And you are trying to go back to your group, and they say, no, now you belong to a different country, so you don't go back, right? So actually, when this whole idea of African regionalism started in the 60s, there was a proposal. I've forgotten who made that proposal, but there was a proposal that there should be a time frame within which all people should, reconnect or regroup with their various ethnic groups. But some of the leaders were against that, and that was because if this plan really went through, some of the countries that we have now would cease to exist. Some of these countries would cease to exist. Okay, so the issue of borders also play a specific role of maintaining these colonial structures. So I think breaking them down would actually lead to the resolution of some of the conflicts that we have. I think so. It wouldn't rather lead to their escalation.
Okay, Norman.
Yeah. I'll be quick. Yes. I think they also. Okay. First of all, going back to the nature of the African state, obviously from independence. The conflicts that existed, going on with what Dr. Boateng was talking about is question of who belongs. And so most of the violence that took place from an ethnic perspective was people were accused of not belonging to the state. And so most of them, if you look at the conflict in Rwanda, Burundi, if you go back to Congo, so in the 90s, the question of identity, do you belong? Are you Congolese? And so this one was one of the major issues that arose, and then obviously we went into the new war dichotomy, I think, whereby we're looking at people wanted to control the state because they believed the state was a source of resources, and so when they control the state, then they invited their people, and so it created more cycles of violence in that regard. And so if you look at the regionalization we're having today, we seem to be overtaken by events in that we are reacting, but at the same time, other things are taking place, and so we are not evolving as fast as we should. And so if you look at the African or the OAU during the 70s and 80s, dealing with conflicts, heavily rooted in protecting sovereignty, that was overtaken by the regionalization. And so it became defunct, and then we went for the African Union. Now, today we're overtaken by conflicts concerning climate change. If you look at the Sahel, pastoralists are fighting farmers, and again, we don't have a policy that we are developing to deal with that, especially cross-border movements. And also, if you look at, I think the Sahel, yes, mainly the pastoralists are they're encroaching on the land. If you look at Darfur, the conflict was heavily rooted in pastoralists versus farmers. But do the regional organizations have a response to such conflicts? Are we reacting, or do we take initiative? And that's one of the biggest challenges that we face, that things are overtaking us and we are not creating institutions to kind of like look ahead. If you look at the formation of the African Union, everybody was like, no, you're all welcome, you're part of the institution, but we crafted it on the model of the European Union. The European Union basically is crafted differently in that you become a member of the EU after meeting a certain criteria. For the AU, we like the model, but everybody should join. And so we've ended up with different stalemates, especially on security, but also even on economic development. So yeah, thanks.
Okay. Do we want to, okay, we see 2 hands, 3.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for your very meaningful input. I really enjoyed listening to all of what you had to say. Just very quickly to that point about ethnic conflicts, because I had to say this. As a media student, I go to Northwestern here. So most of my studies involve studying how the media is so salient in basically propagating some of these conflicts, basically making it a bigger issue than it actually needs to be. And because I'm Ethiopian, this issue speaks to me very personally, because that's also what we're going through as a country. And I mean, congratulations to us. We are suing Meta right now, so the whole fake news situation, the whole this promotion of hate speech is a very real thing, and I think it's high time we stop blaming like African people for the conflicts that they're experiencing, and also like recognizing that there are other parties that have a vested interest in the conflict of African citizens, basically. And then also to Dr. Mumford's point, I'm an African student. I'm not in Africa. I'm studying in basically outside of Africa, buying products that are not African. Basically, everything that you described, except for the part that I'm not a politician's daughter, that's basically me. And yes, okay, great. And therefore, my point is, every time I think of what decolonization would look like in my age and for people of my age, it always circles back to this point of, okay, well, we need economic liberty, right? And with all the continuous, the debts, or you hear about the involvement of the World Bank or the IMF, what would a truly decolonized Africa look like? How are we going to achieve that when we're basically not funding that process, or we don't have the economic abilities to actually put into practice this idea of Pan-Africanism that we were discussing earlier? So yeah, that's basically my question. It goes to all of you.
Thank you. I would suggest we collect the other two and then we take them together.
Yeah, it's on. Thank you very much, panel. It's been really, kind of informative, and you quoted Frantz Fanon, who's been one of my favorite, philosophers and authors. It's truly meaningful to know also the context in Africa in particular. I have a question more, not into the idea of conflicts. I have a journalism background, so kind of we love looking into conflicts and kind of understanding the context more, but more of your point, Dr. Densua, about decolonization. When I think of decolonization, particularly in Africa, I cannot but also help and think of kind of religion as a component, particularly with missionaries, imams, etc. I want to kind of learn more about the opportunities and the challenges in the context of the multi-diverse African context. How does that look like in kind of bringing prosperity, bringing in challenges, and how kind of the youth and future leaders that ground up are kind of bridging that diversity into one interconnected continent.
My question was more of a follow-up to Mr. Boateng's point. It was follow-up to the previous question. So when you said it's all about the power that the leaders have, you consistently mentioned that the hope is in people. From this, do you suggest that there needs to be a revolution arising from the people? Do you believe that is the only way we need to get authorities' attention? Also, how much power do you believe the mentioned organizations have in relation to the state when creating impact for the society? Thank you.
I'm sorry, which organization?
You mentioned that one of the solutions, when you were talking about the solutions, you mentioned that this is the time for organizations to intervene. So my question is more of how much impact do you think they will create in relation to the state for the society's benefits?
I think I'm still lost a little bit. I don't know. Which organization are you talking about? Are you talking of civil society organizations?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. As to how change is going to come, it does not necessarily have to be a revolution. I mean, in different places of the continent, there are cases where people have had to be really vociferous, and in some cases resort to arms to cause change, because we've seen it throughout history. The more difficult it is to change a system through democratic means, the harder you push people to use other means, which may end up, perhaps destabilizing the entire society or parts of it. We see it in almost everywhere. We see it in the US, we see it in parts of Africa, we see it in almost every world region. So change comes through various means. I think people pick and choose what is available to them and what they can do within their context. Okay, so I don't think I have a specific template as to how change should come about. It could come about from different ways in different parts of the continent. Okay, as to how much power civil society organizations have, I think I think their power will lie in the numbers. Like if there are enough people across, let's say, even 20, 30 African countries who believe in one thing, and we see them organizing among themselves. And like, imagine a situation where there is a huge, let's say, trade deal or property market that is outside of the control of the African Union, that functions according to its own logic without any interaction with the African Union. I think that structure will become visible enough for those at the continental level to take some interest in that. Okay, so I think strength will come from the numbers that sign on to these ideas. I mean, from people to people interaction, it's going to take a long time, but I think that is the way to go. Already, like, these elites have already taken enough time. So for me, it's time to try something else, and that will come from these interactions.
Okay, so we'll be taking, this will be the final comments to the questions, and we can round up and continue the conversation as we eat. Densua?
Thank you so much, guys, for your excellent questions. I'm going to kind of answer all of them or both of them with one statement. So I'm going to disagree with Oheneba. It has to be a revolution. It has to be a revolution, but a revolution of the mind, as Fanon said. Revolutions doesn't mean, the word doesn't mean or imply that it has to be violence in sense of physical violence, that we have to go out there shooting people, killing people, nothing like that. What Fanon was talking about, and what many decolonizing and post-colonial scholars and feminist scholars are talking about, is a revolution of the mind. That is new concepts that come from people's own indigenous cultures, concepts and ways of living that are that reflect the way you think about the world as a community, right? So what would a decolonized Africa look like, given that, say, you and I are exactly the elites that Taiwo is critiquing, and he's even critiquing himself in that book, right? A decolonized Africa is one where different African communities have agency over their lives to determine their own communities, how it should be shaped, how it should be governed, the ideas that they use to govern themselves, to share ideas, to share practices, right? To have that agency, that's what decolonization means. And that's basically what colonialism took away, the ability to decide for yourself. And it's not just about colonialism at gunpoint, it's also colonialism of the mind, right? So, there's this concept of decolonizing the mind by Ngugiwa, I always forget, Tiongo, that's right, decolonizing the mind, right? He's talking about, Wationgo talks about using African languages for scholarship. And it's difficult for me to be saying this because I was socialized in an Anglo world. So, the idea of me using African languages to think, I can't do that, right? But I have cousins who can because they grew up with their own languages, right? Why am I here talking about Africa, right? Why isn't someone in a Ghanaian village deciding for themselves what it means for them to decolonize, right? I have opportunities because of the structures in which we exist that people don't, to control their own lives, right? So someone maybe might invite me to the UN to talk about the African condition, and then my ideas get to shape structures. But people actually don't often have as much control over their own lives as they should. So decolonization is about that. And the way to do that is to create alternative spaces, alternative ideas, alternative structures, and practices. It's just to create alternatives. It's really hard. It's really hard to do when you're already stuck in the structures that you were raised with, right? So for me, what decolonization means in my context is actually, one tiny way I've started to practice it is just to read different people. I was trained with rational choice scholars at Oxford, and when I came across decolonization late in my education, I realized, dear God, nobody I ever encountered asked me to read Fanon. Why had I, as an African, not read Fanon? I studied regional organizations. Why had nobody asked me to read Kwame Nkrumah? I'm a Ghanaian. Does that make sense? So I had to consciously, as an adult, say, I'm going to read different people today. I'm going to pick up different books. And that's called decolonization of the mind. Just imbibe different ideas from people who care about your life condition. There are plenty of people out there ready to tell you what to do with your life, but they don't know your life. They don't care about your life. They don't know the actual struggles that you encounter every day. So you need to read people who understand your condition. And it takes a lot of conscious thinking and a lot of conscious resistance on a day-to-day basis. If you're a master's student, if you're a PhD student, your instructors expect you to cite certain people. If you're not citing Mearsheimer, you're not citing, I don't know, Duncan Snyder or something, sorry, that's one of my supervisors. But if you're not citing people, right, that they recognize, you don't get an A, you get an F. And that's the disciplining and the colonialism of the mind. So resisting that when you're relying on grades to progress, I know that's tough, but one day you're going to be in a position where you have a little bit more freedom and agency and use it to read different people and cite different people. That's one way to decolonize. I will stop there because I've ranted on for a long time. Thank you.
And the funny thing is I see a hand. So let's take. The funny thing is that Densua is an African student at Oxford University in the UK. I'm an African student in a Nigerian university, and it's the same thing she's reading that I'm reading. In Nigeria, I'm also not reading African scholars. I'm reading Western scholars. So that's a very important point to note. We have a. No, sorry, we don't have time for more. Oh, okay. Norman, and we finalize with Dalva.
Thanks very much. Some basically final reflections. First of all, it's been an honor to come to Georgetown and meet very interesting people, and thanks for the time. Basically, maybe some closing remarks concern the African state. We need to look at it, especially in the globalizing world. And we need to also, as we think about decolonization, we also need to look at the kind of world we're living in and the structures that exist. And we need to find a way of decolonizing, yes, but also existing in a globalizing world whereby we are interdependent and also accepting other groups of people and working with them, but also having the agency that she's talking about. Yeah, and so maybe that's what I'd like to leave you with. Yeah.
Thank you. And Dalva?
I really like what Professor Mumford said. I think the deconstruction of the colonial identity is one of the biggest projects that we have for Africa, especially for the youth, because I'm talking to you today. My name is Dalva Raposo. This is a full Portuguese name. I speak 4 European languages. I don't know anything about tradition, culture that you can ask me about Africa. If you ask me to situate Ghana on a map, I will not be able to do so. So these are conscious things that we must do every day. I think we don't really sit and take into consideration how much we have been affected by colonialism and neo-colonialism. It's time we break these barriers to our own sovereignty, to our own self-determination in our minds. And I think Alternative spaces is a really good place to do this, but another really good place to do is within the educational system. And then we have the task of convincing our leaders that this is an important task. But then is that task as important to our leaders as it is to the youth? Because us not knowing our history and who we are is a great token for them, because they can use that to use us and abuse us as they want to. So it's fighting a battle on all sides, in my opinion.
Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to everyone for joining us. We have refreshments, so stick around. Let's talk.